Dear fellow truth seekers, thank you and welcome for visiting my channel, MythoReligio. MythoReligio is a series of books about religious comparison studies between the stories in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism and Buddhism, directly from their sacred books and world mythologies, hence the name MythoReligio. The purpose is to retrace the prehistory of humanity, since I am not fully satisfied with either the explanations from the point of view of creationists nor evolutionists. There are so many missing links in both explanations. If you feel the same, then you are on the right channel. In this book series, I will also analyze about the prehistory of humanity from the archaeological records, modern scientific point of view, and other alternative theories, such as the ancient alien theories and Atlantis or Lemuria legends. After thorough research of circa 30 years, I recognize many similarities between all religious stories and even mythologies, and surprisingly, some of them are in accordance or even beyond modern science that have been proven as correct. Thus, I came to the conclusion that all religions must have come from the same source. And all these religious stories and mythologies, although heavily jumbled up, are actually telling one mega story, the true prehistory of our common ancestors. This mega story is quite different than what we have been told to believe and will truly blow your mind, as it is more fascinating than our imagination. If you have watched the earlier videos in this channel, I believe you can see some of the similarities too. If you haven't and you truly want to do a religious comparative study, I suggest that you do so. The best way to do a comprehensive religious study via this channel is by watching the videos starting from number 1 and continue until this present video and so on. That way you will see a clear pattern. For deeper analysis that I cannot share in this platform due to its sensitive nature that leads to the above conclusion, kindly read the books that are available in ebook format that can be found in my website www.mythoreligio.com or the physical books at Amazon in color or black and white version. Dear fellow truth seekers, welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm sharing the 10th video of MythoReligio series. This is a replacement video of the original video number 10 concerning the story of King David that I had to take down due to copyright issue of the background music. Therefore, this video is not arranged in the proper numbering sequel. Now let's go to the story. At this period, there was a righteous prophet called Samuel. Samuel reminded all the house of Israel to return to the Lord with all their hearts and put away their strange gods, and God would deliver them from the hands of the Philistines. The children of Israel listened to Samuel. Samuel offered a lamb and cried to the Lord, and the Lord heard him. So God thundered upon the Philistines and smote them before Israel. This was the end of the era of the judges, and the Israelites demanded to have a king to rule over them. The following stories are summarized from the Book of Samuel and Book of Kings 1 and 2. Saul. Saul was a Benjamite and first king of Israel anointed by Samuel. He started out good and led his people into many wars, gaining victories against their enemies. But later on he developed a haughty spirit and lost God's favor. He ate meat with blood and kept the king Agag of the Amalekites alive and did not utterly kill all the cattle, although his reasoning was that he was going to use the cattle for burnt offerings to the Lord. Samuel commanded Saul to bring King Agag, and Samuel chopped King Agag into pieces before the Lord. David, circa 1024 BCE. While Saul was still ruling, David was also anointed by Samuel as the new king of Israel. According to Book 1, Samuel chapter 17, verse 12, David was an Ephraimite, a descendant of Joseph. But according to the book of Ruth, chapter 1 verse 1 and chapter 4 verse 17, David was from the tribe of Judah. One day, David cured Saul, who was troubled by an evil spirit from God. He cured him by playing the harp, hence earning his favor. During a battle against the Philistines, young David won a challenge fight against a gigantic, uncircumcised man who defies the Lord God of Israel, Goliath, using just a sling. David cut off Goliath's head. The people praised David, and Saul became jealous. Saul offered David to marry his oldest daughter, Merab, although secretly he was hoping that David would be killed by the Philistines. When it was time for the marriage, Saul gave Merab to another man in wedlock. Meanwhile, Michal, another daughter of Saul, was in love with David. Saul saw another opportunity to kill David. Thus, he offered David again to be his son-in-law, this time under the condition that he must bring 104 skins of the Philistines to Saul instead of bringing any dowry. It turned out that not only did David bring 104 skins, he actually brought 200. So Saul had to give him Michal for his bride. David won many battles and was loved by many people, especially Jonathan, Saul's son. Jonathan was the heir to the throne, but he knew and accepted that God had given his right to David. Not only did he accept it, they even made a brotherhood covenant that would endure to the next generation. David had to flee from Israelite land since Saul continued in his attempts to kill him, but never succeeded. Actually, David had a chance to kill Saul but let him live. While he was fleeing, he married the ex-wife of Nabal, a Judean man whom he almost killed because he refused David's invitation to dine together. David also had another wife called Ahinoam. Meanwhile, Saul gave David's first wife Michal to another man. David took refuge on the Philistines' land, and he received the city of Ziklag from the Philistine king. But when David was away, the city was invaded, burned, and the women taken as captives by the Amalekites, descendants of Esau, brother of Jacob. David pursued and smote them, recovering everything they had taken from him. Later, he divided the spoils to all the men who didn't join the war and to all the elders of Judah. And this became the law of Israel until today. Finally, Saul died in a battle against the Philistines. Jonathan and his 2 brothers were also killed. David heard about Saul's death from a young Amalekite man who would claim himself as the slayer of Saul upon Saul's request. On hearing this, David commanded one of his men to kill the young Amalekite for slaying a man who was anointed by God. Later on, David went to a Judean city called Hebron, and here he was anointed as the king of Judah. At the meantime, Ishbosheth, the surviving son of Saul, was anointed as king of Israel. Soon enough, civil war broke between the 2 kingdoms. The United Kingdom of Israel. At the house of Saul, Abner, Ishbosheth's captain, was gaining strength in position. He took a concubine of Saul's to bed. Ishbosheth's son questioned him about that matter. Abner felt insulted upon being questioned. So he went to make a league with David to bring all Israel to his hands. David accepted the offer on condition that Abner brought David's first wife, Michal, Saul's daughter, to him. Ishbosheth fulfilled David's request and took Michal away from her husband. Then Abner talked to the elders of Israel into making David king over Israel. Then he returned to David, saying that he would gather all Israel to make a league with him. David sent Abner away in peace, but on the way, Abner was killed by David's men over a personal vendetta. Meanwhile, Ishbosheth was killed by his own men, who brought his head to David. David was angry and commanded his men to slay them, cut off their hands and feet, and hang them over the pool in Hebron. Meanwhile, the city of Jerusalem was still inhabited by the Jebusites, descendants of African Ham. They said that David would be unable to take over the city, for the blind and the lame would defeat him. However, David did manage to conquer the city. From then on, the blind and the lame were not allowed to enter the palace. Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. Note, Mount Zion or Zion is commonly referred to a specific mountain near Jerusalem. Then the Philistines attacked again and David defeated them. David gathered 30,000 chosen men of Israel to bring the Ark of God from another city to the city of David, Jerusalem. They set the Ark on a cart with David wearing only a linen ephod, dancing before the Lord with all his might. One of his men held the Ark when the oxen shook it. God became angry and smote him. David was scared by the event. Thus, every time they moved 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox. When they arrived at the city of David, one of his wives, Michal, thought David was making a fool of himself. For that, Michal never gave birth to a child until the day she died. Then the Lord gave David rest from all his enemies and established a mighty empire with Jerusalem as the capital city. David repaid Jonathan's son of Saul kindness by taking his surviving son into his house in Jerusalem, even though Jonathan's son was a cripple. Through a prophet, God said that he would establish David's throne forever, because God is David's father, and David was God's son. Book of Psalm chapter 2, verse 7. God would never take his mercy away from David as he did to Saul. Thus, David became strong because God was with him. He took more wives and concubines. One evening, David saw a beautiful woman washing herself. The woman was Bathsheba, wife of Uriah the Hittite, a descendant of Heth, son of Canaan, son of African Ham. David came in unto her, and she became pregnant. David then sent Uriah to a battlefield that he might get killed. After that, David married Bathsheba, and she bore his child. But what he did displeased God. Therefore, God struck their child. But Bathsheba gave birth to another child called Solomon, and God loved this child. Despite the promise of God not to take his mercy away from David, David still received punishment for his adultery through Absalom, who was another son of David. Absalom conspired against David, and he also took David's concubines to bed in a tent witnessed by all Israel. Later, Absalom prepared to fight and to kill King David, his own father. The armies of Absalom and David came to a battle in the woods. Absalom's hair was caught in the branches of an oak tree, and David's generals slew him as he hung there. King David returned to Jerusalem, kept his concubines in his house, but never touched them again until his dying day. Then there was another rebellion against David by a Benjamite called Sheba. David told his general, Amasa, to gather the soldiers within 3 days. Amasa didn't return when he was supposed to, so David sent Joab and the mighty men who found Amasa at the great stone at Gibeon. Joab said, "How are you, my brother?" and took Amasa by the beard to kiss him. Amasa didn't notice the sword in Joab's hand until Joab stabbed him, and his bowels spilled out onto the ground. The man said, "If you support King David, you must follow Joab." But no one moved because Amasa was wallowing in blood in the middle of the road. Then the man dragged the body into a field and covered it with a cloth. After that, the people followed Joab, gathering tribes as they went. They cornered Sheba at Abel and battered at the city wall until a wise woman cried from within, "Why would you destroy an Israeli city?" Joab agreed and asked her to hand him Sheba. So then the woman told the people to cut off Sheba's head and tossed it out to Joab. Joab blew a trumpet and returned with a mighty men to Jerusalem. Then, after David's restoration to the throne, came a famine that lasted for 3 years. God told David that this was a punishment for Saul. who in his zeal to the children of Israel had slain the Hivites from Gibeon. The Gibeonites were the only people who made a peace treaty during Joshua's battles. Joshua used them as servants for Israel, sparing their lives. David asked them what they sought to repay for the iniquity in order to prevent God's punishment. The Gibeonites demanded that David delivered them 7 descendants of Saul to be hanged. This was a difficult choice, since David had given his word to spare the life of Jonathan's son, who was crippled. So he fulfilled the demand of the Gibeonite by giving 7 descendants of Saul with his concubine Rizpah, without giving Jonathan's son away. After being hanged, David treated the dead bodies of Saul's descendants to proper burials. Then the famine ceased. Towards the end of his reign, David fought more battles, including against the giants of the Philistines and 6-fingered giants, and he was still victorious. And David sang the famous psalm, a sacred hymn of praises to the Lord. David died and was buried in the city of David. Herewith ends the story of King David. Kindly watch video number 11 to continue with the story of King Solomon according to the Bible. Thank you for watching and hope to see you on my next video.